Welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with a gentleman that is head of the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. He's Flavio Volpe. And number one, I really am interested in a lot of the things that have happened in Ottawa and auto parts over the course of the last couple of years, as well as during COVID-19. But most importantly, I wanted to talk to him tonight about a partnership that he's just put together with a local medical technology firm to manufacture and supply the Ontario government with ventilators. And I think that, one of the things that I've been trying to do is focus on a lot of companies that have, and other individuals that have been trying to really help out, make money, keep jobs, and supply products and services during this pandemic, rather than those that just sort of sit back and wait things out and hope for the best. So Flavio, how are you? Welcome to the Brian Crombie Show.
Good. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So tell me, you say you've been president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Union for how long?
Almost 6 years now, and probably 3 or 4 crises in. We did the TPP negotiations, we did the NAFTA negotiations, General Motors closing in Oshawa, and I was joking with someone about 2 months ago. I said, "Oh, we need another crisis," and lo and behold, here we are with the worst one.
And what do you think, in general, has happened to automotive parts manufacturers during this COVID-19 pandemic? Have they all been shutting down? What has been sort of the general reaction?
Well, we were all on I had the fortune of being on the essential services list, yet we were all idle for about 8 weeks. That's because the market died. And if you're not buying cars, car makers aren't buying parts. So we stayed working for about a week or two to build up a bit of an inventory so that when the automakers went back to work, they had some inventory to start slowly and reliably. And a whole bunch of us went into making personal protective equipment and life-saving equipment, test swabs and ventilators, of course, but tens of millions of masks, face shields, and gowns as well.
So, obviously, parts manufacturers, you must be, used to scaling up changeovers set up for different parts on a fairly regular basis. Was this a challenging thing to do, given that it was healthcare and automotive, or just another part?
Well, that the IP for a lot of these things, of course, sits with other companies. It sits with medical technology companies who are healthy companies in the business of making hundreds of something, in some cases thousands of something, almost none of them manufacturing in Canada. If you want to sell to Canadian public sector procurement, you've got to get a Health Canada certification at least, but it's usually other certification, international certifications like ASTM and NIOSH. So maybe the weekend of March the 14th and 15th that we started to see it, of course, we're very in tune to trade dynamics with our biggest trading partners. We saw the EU say export controls on medical devices and everything from life-saving ventilators to masks. So that if the EU is going to stop exporting, number one, do we have any domestic sources? Number two, to those domestic sources, can they manufacture at scale? Number three, what's our option? I spent that weekend talking to the Ontario Minister of Economic Development and the Federal Minister of Industry, and what we agreed was that I would call on our members to volunteer their scale. So if we were going to help out, never mind the government side of it, from our side of it, who's got the capacity to make tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of X? Then the government promised us a list of what X was. What do you need and at what volume? We spent the next maybe week or so, both parties, government and us, trying to implore manufacturers from around the world to get into contract manufacturing arrangements with Canadian auto parts suppliers. Most of those were us being politely declined. The ventilator space, I think, I could say was a tough space to break into. Everybody who makes ventilators thinks they're more complicated than cars. They are not. They require different certification without question. They're worried about protecting their market. I talked to the biggest ventilator manufacturers around the world, and they said, we'll figure it out ourselves. You know, at the time we were talking about peak need in Canada, somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000, and we had 5,000 sitting in
What?
storage.
Hold it. So you're saying we had 5,000 ventilators and we needed 50,000?
So before we all decided to do the lockdowns that spread across the country, all the social distancing, all the stay at home, the modeling showed that if the general public interacted with each other through that period, the level of infections would lead to an acute care need somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 ventilators. And we had 5,000. And so a combination of all the lockdown orders that have happened over the last 8 to 10 weeks, and our ability to source a whole bunch locally from one of the ones that you just referred to, has got us to the point where we're covered. But in that first week or so, I had everybody politely telling me to go fly a kite. So what we did was we looked very hard to find, was there anybody here who made them but didn't sell them to Health Canada? Got the Health Canada certification, but didn't have Health Canada as a customer. You know, for their production all geared to export. So we found a company called O2. O2 Medical specialized in transport ventilators. You know, the kind that you would imagine that if you had an emergency need and the paramedics showed up and they put you on a ventilator, they're those. Different in size and feature from the ones you might find in an intensive care unit. But they had geared one up, this model called the 700E, that said, look, it's going to have almost all of the attributes. We spent some time talking to them. We spent some time talking to University Health Network and said, okay, look, between the two, the fact that it already had a Health Canada certification, can we help them scale up to the amounts that we needed? And so we had signed at that point, this is probably now in the last week of March, first week of April, the largest procurement build order of ventilators in Canadian history.
How many?
For 10,000 of them. And of course, famously, the Prime Minister and the federal government also procured other build orders for another 30,000. But the first ones, the ones that were showing up when the days were darkest, were the ones that we sourced locally from a company called O2, and I'm very proud of that effort.
Now, when you say you sourced them, O2 produced them, or did one of your automotive parts manufacturers produce them?
So what happened was a consortium of companies led by Linamar, but also supported by Magna and ABC, with advice on optimization from companies like Martin Ray as well. These are 4 of the 5 biggest Canadian supplier companies, globally ranked companies that do about $50 billion of business a year, came together to help O2 ramp up production to levels that over the course of the order would probably be in the space of 4 months, 4 or 5 times what their annual capacity would have been. And so that
O2,
means
O2 is a Canadian company. Where are they located?
O2 is a Canadian company. It's on the border there of Brampton and Mississauga, and we're out here on the 427 and Burnhamthorpe. On a clear day we can almost see them, and doing everything locally. Of course, a lot of the subcomponents are global, just like every other business, just like in the automotive business. But working with these companies to make to streamline the manufacturing, doing some of the subcomponent manufacturing, doing some of the tooling, doing some of the inline testing, able to turn around and deliver ventilators within 30 days to the provincial government at the time, and arriving just in time, to be honest.
Well, this is fantastic. We're chatting tonight with Flavio Volpe. He's the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association. He's just told us how he came up with an idea to produce ventilators and other PPE, got manufacturers involved, and delivered the biggest order of ventilators in Canadian history. We're going to take a break for messages and come back and understand a little bit more about exactly how they did that and what lessons we've learned from it. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association. Flavio, you were telling us that you worked with, I think it was Linamar and Magna and a couple of other of your manufacturers to help out O2, who had the patents and the Health Canada clearance for the ventilators. did they actually take on some of the component manufacturing, or did they just advise?
Some advised and some took on the component manufacturing. Some did subcomponents. ABC, for example, is a plastic specialist. So what they focused on was the plastic parts that went into the system. Linamar is an industrial assembly expert. And so between what they did with O2, but with several other ventilator manufacturers in the country, they played a manufacturing mentorship role, as well as doing a lot of the metal sub component structures. Same thing with Magna. Martin Rea advised initially, were very key at the beginning to make a real practical assessment of whether O2 could take this on. And Martin Rea's efforts in ventilators stretched into the General Motors effort. And one of their plants not too far from here up in Vaughan made components for 30,000 ventilators that were built in the US with subcomponents from here. That whole consortium of automotive scale suppliers and industrial assembly is what allowed O2, but also a series of other Canadian-based ventilator builds to become real.
Now, what was in it for you? Did you make money out of this, or was this just something you did because you're a nice guy?
Somewhere in between. I didn't make any money at this, but you're gonna have to talk to other people about whether I'm a nice guy or not. You know, right next door to the office is a long-term care home, Eatonville Long-Term Care Center that, you know, people may or may not know from the news, but I mean, I can see it from my window here. 42 people have passed away there. 240 people tested positive. We're not in the medical devices business, and I've been saying to people, this is an industry, when it's working, automotive parts, we ship $100 million worth of parts a day. If we do $500 million worth of medical devices this whole year, I'd be very surprised. So there's no money in it. And certainly all these companies that I listed and the ones that went into the other parts, the other PPE categories, most of them did it before they got a purchase order. So all of it was driven by a spirit of, we're all in this together. We've got the capacity. It became newly idle, but when we made those offers on March 15th, 16th, until the industry shut down about a week and a half later, these were companies that were volunteering to do it while they were making auto parts. It was admirable. It was a noble effort, and frankly, it felt good.
You know, you remind me of those gentlemen during World War II. I think they were called $1-a-year men that all volunteered to go and run the munitions and war effort in Ottawa. They were past the age of where they could volunteer to go to war, but they were experienced manufacturers. You might be interested in your current role that my grandfather was a vice president of the Canadian Manufacturers Association, and he, for 3 years, worked for $1 a year in Ottawa, doing exactly the same thing, but for a war effort. And out of the sense of duty, goodness of his heart, and the desire to make a difference.
It's generous for you to put me in the same sentence as people like your grandfather. Luckily, we haven't seen war in this country since then. And this is a generational challenge for us. I do think that I've been saying for a while, it was our catchphrase here, if you don't ask yourself what more you can do, we're going to fall short. And some of this stuff was easier to do than people give us credit for. And it felt really good to do it. And frankly, if we didn't solve it, if we had the capacity and we could build at scale and we couldn't solve it, then, you know, I'm not sure how we could go forward and say that, you know, we're contributors to society in Canada when all that we're looking at is what's profitable and what isn't. It's not profitable. Who cares though? You know, I have a gentleman, I'll probably embarrass him by mentioning him, but there's a guy named Joe, runs a plastics company called Mitchell Plastics in Kitchener. And I called them early on in the process. I said, look, I have an open source for face shields, CDC approved in the US, and I'm working on getting Health Canada approval here. Can you give it a look? And, you know, normally I'd ask this question and people get back to me within a couple of days, look, we'll do our due diligence, I'll let you know. Joe got back to me probably within the hour. We had a long discussion about his sister being a registered nurse at a hospital here in Toronto, talking about what the shortages were, what the anxiety was. And he probably cut a prototype within 24 hours, maybe, sourced the sheets. You know, when you're doing face shields, hold on, I got one behind me. When you're sourcing face shields, it isn't just a plastic sheet and the cheapest foam and elastic. This has to be fog-free. You've got to be able to wear this for a while. It's got to have enough coverage. You got to be able to cut them in systemic, measurable pieces. You've got to be able to run these sheets. You got to be able to source this material. Joe, within a couple of days, sourced enough material that we supplied to a whole series of other face shield providers. He probably made 120,000 of these. Yeah, I'm probably ballpark a few thousands before he even got a purchase order. He said to me, look, it'd be nice to get cost recovery on these. And you know, they're about $2, $3 each, plus the tool to make them. He goes, it'd be nice to get it. But if we don't, we're just going to ship it out to all the hospitals. And he, you know, we heard the news here next door. I called Joe and he sent over 750 of these immediately. We went to pick them up, dropped them off. And somebody told the premier. The premier went and mentioned him in his next day's press conference. And next thing you know, Joe's got the purchase order to cover them. The spirit of his decision is repeated 25 times over with all the other suppliers that did the same things. And it's that sequence of, yeah, sure, we'll do it. If I can do it, I'm going to do it. And if we have to eat the cost, we'll eat it. It'd be nice if we didn't. But they got going because the need was urgent. And, you know, I've done everything in this job that you could do in the auto business. White House meetings, dinner with the president of Mexico during NAFTA negotiations. I've had media interviews all over the world, Economist features, Bloomberg. There is nothing that has felt better than the reaction of people like Joe, and the reaction of the general. My inbox, I mean, for a while there was the best example of the humanity that ties us all in this country, in this province. Healthcare workers who would send me messages, tearful messages, where I understood that what we were providing here wasn't just medical implements. We're providing hope. And, you know, thank God we've been able to get a hold on this beast here in this province. You know, I'd spent some time in New York City not too long ago. You know, I almost feel like I just got out of there just in time. You know, New York City is the center of the universe. They don't lack for anything, and they got overrun. Could have happened here, and I'm glad that people's anxiety has come down, and we're starting to reopen, and we'll forget about this maybe.
I hope we don't. I hope we don't, because I think that the chance of it coming back, whether it's a second wave or something else soon, is large. And, you know, lots of people warned us about this. You know, the Bill Gates TED Talk from a couple of years ago is what a lot of people refer to, but lots of other people. You know, even a Hollywood thriller movie about the coming potential pandemic. So there's been lots of people that have talked about it. And I just yesterday interviewed someone who's convinced and gave me a list of 4 different types of diseases that could be coming in the next short while. So I think we need to learn from it. I interviewed Tony Clement a couple of days ago, former Minister of Health during SARS, and he said that there was a big commission after a public hearing process after SARS. And he said, we forgot the majority of the findings and recommendations that came out of the SARS, and we need to remember that. So I think we need to remember it, and we need to put together the processes such that you can do the great work that you did, but more quickly in the next time. And you know, lots of people have talked about the potential for a second wave in the fall, which I think we need to get ready for. What do you think, if you knew that there was a 50% or greater chance of a second wave in the fall, what would you be doing now to get ready for it?
We think there is going to be one. What we're trying to do is institutionalize some of the emergency manufacturing that we've done here, which is even with the auto industry going back, we're going back at a less than optimal facility utilization. We've got excess capacity for manufacturing. If we think in a next wave we need 100 million masks, it's no problem. Make the orders. If you need 100 million shields, I mean, these are not throwaway numbers. We can make them. And it is not a money-making proposition, as I've said before, but if the provincial and federal governments would cover the costs of these manufacturers, they'd be all in and they'll stay. We got caught short, knowing that there's going to be a second wave, or even if there isn't, the expenditure, the quantum of a few $100 million of stuff that doesn't expire on the shelves is an expense that we should be taking. There are a lot of people who have been talking, and it is disappointing to hear, well, we overspent on ventilators. We didn't need them. Well, I'll tell you what, if we didn't all have shelter in place, so to speak, we would have needed every single one of them. And we would have needed them before we actually had them. And they don't expire. Put them on the shelves. Lend them to jurisdictions that need them. CEDA's done a lot of good work, or whatever we're calling it now, has done a lot of good work with using the Canadian flag in underdeveloped countries. Canadian manufacturing is so well seated to be the protector of the vulnerable. This is something, and I'm saying this as if this isn't an active discussion. It's a very active discussion directly with the people that matter. The Premier himself, the Deputy Prime Minister, we're all in that space. The Federal Minister of Procurement, the Federal Minister of Industry, the Provincial Minister of Economic Development, we're all talking about the same things. I'm imploring everybody in our business to make sure that they're available for, even if you're not manufacturing right now, we might need you. And those that are manufacturing, keep that capacity open and available. Because if we don't need them, I assure you, we spent some time talking to the World Economic Forum and the WHO. There's a market for it. I'll find a market for you. But I think what we've learned here is that there's a dignity in making things. We've spent the last couple of decades, especially from a procurement point of view, is chasing the best value for public dollars. And I'm not going to Monday morning quarterback that decision. It's probably the right thing to do. There's a finite amount of public dollars available. But if you're going to chase the best price for the plastic takeout container for your restaurant, okay. But don't chase the best price for this and then get caught short on export restrictions, because everybody else got the same problem. And if there's any legacy to what we did here, I hope it's this. I hope that people see the value in manufacturing again. Everybody's kids, including mine and maybe yours, wants to be a developer of some sort. All the app writers in California didn't save that state from lockdown measures. But I think that all the people on the lines who were making masks and gowns may have.
Well, I think this time of COVID-19 and staying at home, et cetera, has reminded us about who the essential workers are. They're truckers and grocery store clerks, and obviously the healthcare workers and people in some of your plants that are producing PPE. This issue on global trade is concerning. The one that's sort of the most well-known is President Trump telling 3M they couldn't ship masks across the border. Do you think that we are going to have a rupture in global trade supply chains?
The answer is yes. I think COVID's just exacerbated the trend of the last 3 years, of course, led by this administration in Washington. Since the Maastricht Treaty in '92 solidified that European Common Union, and then the NAFTA deal in 1994, all major trading countries sought free trading agreements that reduced the local value in a product, the level of local value that was required for tariff-free sale. I think that ended with the failure of the TPP to get the Americans on board. And it was a bipartisan failure. It would have been Hillary Clinton, as the Democrat nominee, said that she would pull out of the TPP just the same as Donald Trump did. What the administration in Washington is doing, the ideology behind it, is about nearshoring. You don't have to agree with it or not, but when the world's #1 economic engine sets its sight on punishing the world's #2 in China, you see that trend reverse. So in COVID, during this pandemic, it was a little bit more acute from that the Trump administration's mismanagement of the pandemic writ large, but also especially the PPE end of it, saw them for a couple of days hold up 3M exports to Canada. But that wasn't really a surprise for those of us who did the NAFTA negotiations. I'm not during TPP and NAFTA, I was accused of being a globalist. And now during this, there was a famous Toronto Star opinion piece that said, I'm a nationalist. I'm not either of them. It's, look, we're here. You have primary responsibility for the people who are your constituents. I'm not elected, but I represent 100,000 people who make stuff. If helping your companies and people make stuff also helps to keep them safe, and that's true in every jurisdiction now, you're going to see a lot more of countries' major industrial engines taking care of themselves. And I think that same trend that we saw from 92, 94 to 2016 is going to do this. It is going to be a massive rupture. It's not going to be a U-turn, but we're going to do this.
We're chatting with Flavio Volpe. He's the president of the Canadian Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. And as he said, he has 100,000. He's in charge of 100,000 people that make stuff. We're going to take a quick break for messages and be right back. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Flavio Volpe. He's the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. He's told us how late March, early April, he noticed that the EU was stopping export of PPE and got the idea that we needed to produce some stuff here in Canada. And he quickly got some people together and manufactured initially 10,000 ventilators. And he talks about how it was not necessarily for the money. It wasn't even for keeping the jobs, but it was to contribute to a healthcare crisis, to a public healthcare crisis. And so I think that that's unbelievably commendable. We need more people that are going to be doing that. We also talked about trade restrictions, and you were just chatting about, you thought that the trend to globalization would go the opposite direction. It's a little bit concerning to me because I interviewed an economist earlier this week that said that we weren't in a Great Recession, we were approaching a Great Depression. And the Great Depression was exacerbated by a very similar kind of nationalistic fervor that raised tariff barriers and increased costs and decreased jobs worldwide. Are you worried that this is going to make whatever our economic situation is worse?
I don't disagree with that outlook, especially when with regards to describing how we're going to slip further from a recession into a depression if we think that way. I am worried about nationalization of priorities, especially when it comes to an industry and an economy like ours that needs export. 37 million people is nothing in the automotive world. We are the world's 10th largest manufacturer from a national ranking point of view of automobiles, but we only make and buy about 2% of the global capacity. The stuff we make here, 75% of it goes to the U.S. 75% of what we buy comes from somewhere else. We don't build where we sell, and so if we start to restrict those borders, at least in our business, the only loser will be us. We need those global markets. Very specifically, we need that American market. In part, we need the Mexican market as a growing offshoot of it. All of this is sociology, really. Economics, the ink is dry on my, well dried on my degrees. But I do remember studying supply and demand. And in that supply and demand, there was always an outside dynamic, which was sociological consumer behavior based on external outputs. And that external output is this fear of getting sick and the fear of getting sick. You can't turn on the news. Well, here we are. You're talking to me. If this was a year ago, all we'd be talking about was the new NAFTA, and all anybody's talking about is COVID. People aren't buying cars. Americans aren't buying cars. If consumer confidence dips because of it, and those consumers start to say, "Look, I want made in Canada solutions because I'm upset because Donald Trump wants to restrict our access to 3M's N95 masks," we're just going to end up in a spiral that you don't come out of that spiral. You hit flat, and then you rebuild from there. And we've learned nothing from the lessons of the past. We are inextricably tied to the American consumer market. There is no other way. All the last 30 years of consecutive governments, consecutive federal governments of different stripes, both stripes. We're building our export capacity. We're gonna trade with China. We're gonna trade with India. We're gonna trade with the Europeans. We're gonna trade. None of that has built anything that rivals the influence of the U.S. market. In the end, when you make things, you have to put them on something like a train or a truck or a boat. And it's much easier to put them on a truck and get them across the border. And there's demand across the border. We can't win from this. And the tempered response from the federal government that has received some criticism, and I don't abide by that criticism, of the tempered response to Trump's protectionism. Some of us, including me, sometimes said, well, you got to punch the bully back in the nose, but I give them full credit. What happens in Washington is the president will say something. Everybody's hair will be on fire for a couple of days. Ottawa doesn't react. We spend the next 2 or 3 days smoothing that out. And almost invariably, it ends up with an exemption for Canada. We need that. We don't need someone reacting in Ottawa in the way that a lot of us might from a sociological point of view. All we need in Ottawa is the strategy to keep that border open. This is especially if we end up in a second wave or a W recovery that is going to lead to a lot of failures in our business. We absolutely cannot survive and or have any chance at a sustainable return to this Canadian market only, because it won't happen.
So what's the solution? We've got this new NAFTA. We have had what you've described as maybe a tepid, but the appropriate response from the Prime Minister toward what you described as the bully in the White House, and it seems to have worked, and the borders have stayed somewhat open. Angus Reid came out today with a poll that said the vast majority of Canadians don't want the border reopened to travel from the United States. So we are worried in Canada. Consumers are about the infection coming back from the United States. We see that we've done a better job than the Americans. We don't like their approach to this virus. What's going to happen?
I think, first of all, there's an election year in the U.S. We may or may not see a regime change. I think it's a coin flip, really. I think we need to stay close to the U.S. regardless. Remember that the U.S. and Canada are partners, and then although it's difficult with the current administration, forget about the personalities. Long term, our fortunes have always been tied to the dynamics of that market. Make the sacrifices you need to stay close to them. If there's a regime change, hopefully there's also a change in the outlook on how you treat your closest partners. But if we have a COVID cloud hanging over the global economy for the next year or two, the Americans are going to get increasingly protectionist. Right now, this administration is looking for partners to choose between them and China. I think we've done. I mean, we've been clumsy through some of it, but we've stayed on the right side of it. The peril of us getting away from the Americans on this, we'll see us our economic prosperity curve drop. If what we're going to see are borders that stop the movement of goods. I totally agree with the restricting the movement of people. We saw last week Texas get its highest numbers ever. Texas has a population twice the size of Ontario, almost exactly twice the size. They had 1,800 new cases the day before they opened. What the news coverage said was they opening rodeos and restaurants and bowling alleys. I like how they're all in the same sentence. 1,800 translates to 900 in Ontario. We're very worried today that the Ontario number isn't dipping, that it's plateauing, but it's plateauing at 400. Can't imagine what extra trouble we'd be in if a lot of those open U.S. states had flights in and out. And of course, it doesn't. You don't need 1 million people coming in to cause a problem. You just need 1,000 people infected coming in to cause a problem, or 1,000 people from here that don't need to go there and come back. And so I think we're doing the right things with the borders. I don't know how sustainable it will be. You know, we have a president who's going to increasingly want to look like we don't have a problem as he gets into his election season, and wanting to declare this yesterday's issue and saying we're opening the border and see how Ottawa reacts to that. We are, you know, Brian, we're in unprecedented waters in everything. I keep saying to people who say, you know, we're going to get to a new normal and some of that is not going to look like your old normal. You've got to get used to that. I say the old world is dead. We'll never go back to exactly how we were. Because even if we do go back, post World War II, we're going to go back with a collective PTSD. What are the values that have changed? And you got people staying at home all over the world. What's important to you? It's a deeply personal thought. People don't express that maybe, but they've been tested. They know. You know, this pandemic has tested leadership, and the results are in. You know what it means to, you know, we'll take the Premier of Ontario here. Polling showed that he was the most unpopular Premier in the history of polling about a year ago.
Yep.
Now, I won't go into the politics of why, but same polling shows that he's the most popular Premier in history. You know, it wasn't a conversion on the way to Damascus. It was this pandemic tested him. He's out there every day, and he's saying the types of things and doing the types of things that give people comfort in their time of most fear and need. Is he getting it right? I mean, for the most part, it sounds like he's getting it right. Does it mean he's going to get it right when we come out of this? If we come out of this, I don't know. It may go back to what it was before.
Well, I reminded by lots of people that 1944, the British people defeated Winston Churchill, the prime minister that won the Battle of Britain and probably saved the free world. Elected a different government. 4 years later, they kicked out the other government and brought Winston Churchill back in again. The most popular mayor, supposedly in history, was Rudolph Giuliani after 9/11. And after the initial attacks in Iraq, the most popular popular president was George W. Bush. Politics is up and down.
It really is, but I use, and you know, and I'm a student of history as well. We try to learn from that, and we're in a strange place where everybody is at home. And for about the first month, everybody was watching the 11 o'clock Prime Minister press conference and then your 1 o'clock provincial premier press conference. And I bet you Winston Churchill, if he was on TV, if he was on radio, every day might have had a different result. If we lived in a social media era, it might have had a different result. You know, look at the Prime Minister of Canada lost a popular vote less than a year ago, and he's out there every day. And there is something about human beings getting the comfort of hearing from someone every day, gives them a familiarity with them, ascribes to them, I think, a personality and a character that they would never have given them the time to do it.
But only if they've got something valid to say and people believe them. So Tony Fauci in the United States, unbelievably trustworthy. The polls on his trustworthiness are out of the stratosphere. Governor Andrew Cuomo, New York State, same thing. President Trump, he's out there, or was, every day. People didn't believe him. And he said some pretty silly things.
Hey, you should Google my name and Donald Trump's name and see my commentary on him over the last few years. There'll be lots of books written on him that I don't know if any of them will be flattering. I think Dr. Fauci I think his popularity has saved his job because he's saying all the right things right after or sometimes with the guy who's saying all the wrong things. But even the guy, I think, who says all the wrong things is looking for the similar comfort of the knowledge that that Dr. Fauci and some of his colleagues bring, which brings us to where we are in this. We're in this crazy world, Brian, where we're listening to medical officers around the world. And then we're listening to briefings from elected politicians who quote those medical officers. Did you know who the Canadian chief medical officer was? I didn't know.
No.
I didn't know who the provincial one or any of the number of the municipal ones were. We're in a space where people are more in tune with health, general health and safety than ever before. We have if you go visit an emergency room right now or a doctor's clinic right now, it's a ghost town. So people who otherwise in a normal time may have gone to do a hospital visit or a doctor's visit are, I think, first of all, scared to do it, but also self-informing themselves. The consciousness, the general sociological consciousness of personal health is probably at an all-time high. And I think even with these reopenings, you'll see I'm overlooking Highway 427 here. You know, the economy's been materially reopened. There's still nobody on the highway. This is not, you know, lifting the dam and the flow of water goes. There are a lot of clogs in the system, and most of those are in here with people.
Yeah, but then you saw the pictures of the bars and the parks and whatnot when bars reopened in Wisconsin and the parks were opened in Central Park, and waves of people, not social distancing, were out there.
Yes, and I think that there are a smaller proportion of the population than the people who are still anxious and waiting at home. And the problem with this disease is that it's the spread of infection is so quick and acute that it takes 2 or 3% of the population to bring everybody else back to where we were in March. It's going to be like this for the next few months. And Brian, I think there was a piece in today's Toronto Star by Bruce Arthur saying, look, the Premier hasn't even faced his toughest question. His toughest question might be, if the numbers continue to go this way, is he really going to make a decision to close again? I don't know. I can't believe we made a decision to close. I could never have predicted that the global economy would have shut down and every jurisdiction would have done what it did. So is it completely out of the question that we do it again if we had to? I don't think it's out of the question. This is why I think we're in this crazy world. And, you know, I represent companies that make parts for cars. And, you know, and I'm being very candid when I say this. I'm not sure that people care about cars right now. And those that do, will get the ones we make. But car companies and parts companies have to think very deeply about the conscious of the market and work towards it. And we will not have none of the forecasts show a return to normal in volumes for the next 5 or 6 years. And who will succeed? Well, I've got 25 companies right now making PPEs, and they did them in short order for the public sector. But I've been saying that every one of them, you know, before you decide that at the end of those contracts you're out, think about whether 20 million Canadians will need to wear face masks. 20 million Canadians leaving their houses every day will need a face mask. If they need one mask a day, 5 days a week, that's 100 million masks a week. How many do we have on the shelves? If we have 100 million on the shelves, I'd be surprised. That's a week. Stay in the business. That might be a diversification that'll allow you to survive this period and whatever it is. I don't think it's 6 months. I don't think it's a year. I think we talk about a year and a half, and those are always the best.
And I think it's not just masks. It's your shields that you're talking about that I think you're going to see a lot of workers in grocery stores, not just in healthcare centers, wearing. And I think that you're going to be putting up pods, booths in restaurants and other places, whether it's plexiglass or fiberglass or I don't know what glass in between different seats. You know, I was talking to a gentleman the other day and said, you know what, we're all going to go back to that old Get Smart show where we had the cone of silence that came down around us to protect us. So I think your manufacturers are going to have some opportunities if they think about the new future. Anyway, we're going to take a break, come back more in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Flavio Volpe. He's the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. He says he has 100,000 people that he's in charge of, or he's responsible for, who make stuff. And I think that's a great line, 100,000 people who make stuff. I'm concerned about these ventilators. I've heard the statistic that 80% of the people that are on ventilators don't survive. Do you think it's something wrong with the ventilators? Should we be improving them somehow? Is the virus far worse than we thought? Is it somehow impacting the lungs? From what I'm told, it's when you put it in the throat and the lungs become reliant on it, they can never become non-reliant on it. Is there something we need to be doing in your fancy CAD shops and design shops to improve these ventilators?
You know, I'm not in the medical field, and I'm not a physician, but I'll say this: what we've been reading and what we've been researching is what you talked about. Is that if you get to the point where you need a ventilator to help you breathe, the ventilator may save your life, but it's at some point you have to come off the ventilator and see if those lungs will work and see if the system responds. We lost someone, a close friend of a friend. You know, I coach baseball, and he's a fellow coach, 41 years old, went to the UK in the middle of March, came back, otherwise healthy individual, ended up on a ventilator. And when they went to go, made the medical decision to take him off the ventilator and see how it would go, he passed away. I'll say to you what I said to others who've asked the same question. I don't know if that number, 80%, is correct, but it's in that ballpark. But if a ventilator costs $10,000 and 1 in 5 people don't make it, so let's call that cost $50,000. $50,000 to keep that guy alive, something I would have paid out of my pocket. $50,000 times the 42 people who are dead next door. Please, I'd take a mortgage for those people. It is, until we find something better, let's not be too concerned with all the things that are wrong with our best option. Our very best option was to keep people separate from each other, and where we can't, to put gloves and masks and shields on them. And I think we need to get used to that. Until we find something that says, God, you don't need to go on a ventilator. You know, I read a story yesterday about, look, everybody's talking about vaccines. On the other side, looking, is there a solution, an antibody solution that is a short-term immunobooster that may be able to be re-administered a few times until we get to the vaccine or until the disease disappears like SARS apparently did. Until we get there, and the billions, and you would know this, the billions that are invested in paths that don't, trials that don't make it, then let's spend those hundreds of millions on that equipment that kind of works. The lessons we learned from Italy, for example, you know, of course, Northern Italy got overrun, and some of the ventilator techs, some of the anesthetists who were using them said, not only are you relying on, is your lungs relying on that machine to help you breathe, but you're in a position where you're putting pressure on those lungs. So there are higher incidence of people making it out after being on a ventilator if they put them on their stomach. So you relieve the pressure on it. Now, of course, that means that you're going to have more people hours watching that individual patient. But it's a very small thing, but we learned something from that. And that practice was used all over the world after that. A lot of the Italian hospitals, and for that matter, the Chinese hospitals, that were using the plasma of recovered patients to test antibodies, have seen some good movement on recovery. I read a study out of the University of Padova in Italy that said the injection of recovered patients' plasma into current patients reduced the recovery time from 16 days to 6 days. And for those who had fever, almost 100% incidence of the elimination of the fever, which, as we all know, if the body's in a state where it's in a fever, it's an indication of where you're, it's an indication of the strength of your immunity at that point. And so, I mean, will these theories survive clinical trials? We don't know. they cost hundreds of millions and billions of dollars when we get into pharmacology. We just make stuff that you can hold and feel, and it's a short-term. These are short-term protections, kind of like a bulletproof vest is a short-term protection, but overall peace is better. And until we have overall peace, the only thing that we can affect is we'll put a vest on you, maybe we'll put a helmet on you, and hope that other people smarter than us at a higher pay grade figure out how to keep you completely from the hospital.
Well, Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, this has been a fascinating conversation. I thank you and your members that have stepped up to the plate to manufacture PPE. And I thank you for your words of wisdom. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry the time's up because I want to ask you about the new NAFTA, about TPP, and about a whole bunch of other stuff. Maybe you'll agree to another interview with me. Thanks so much.
Anytime, and thank you for letting me tell the story. If I had the time, there'd be hundreds of people that I could name that deserve the credit for the work that we've done. For now, I'll be their voice, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life telling their stories because there are so many and they've given so much.
Thanks very much. Stay with us. I'm going to come back in just a minute with some concluding comments. Well, what an interesting conversation with Flavio Volpe, the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, and how we got a bunch of people together to produce in a very quick time frame PPE for a need that we had. He said a couple of things that I want to underline that I think is really interesting. He talked about motivation. I pushed him to see if it was keeping jobs, and some of the people that I've interviewed, as you know, have said that keeping jobs going was one of the motivations, and he said, yeah, but not a real one. I asked him if it was profit. He said a lot of the people did the prototypes and started manufacturing before they even had purchase orders, and so it wasn't necessarily for the profit. What it was because they wanted to contribute. And he pointed to the window and he looked at the seniors home next door and talked about how many people were infected and how many people passed away. And you know what? I think that's the key, that a whole bunch of people really are feeling impacted by what's going on and think and have this uncontrollable desire to contribute. And that's wonderful. And, it's one of those things that we talk about in business and in leadership a lot of times is that you've got to have a vision that's beyond just making money. You got to have a vision to actually contribute, a product that people want or a service that people want. And, what he talked about is the perfect example about it. The other thing that I think that he mentioned, which I think is really interesting and very concerning, is this post-traumatic stress that we're all probably going to be suffering as we come out of this. People have talked about the public health crisis is crisis one, the economic crisis is crisis two, but the long-term mental health issue is probably crisis three. And we need to think about that and address that, both from a positive and a negative standpoint. I think some people are going to be really excited about how we all came together and solve this, but a lot of other people are going to be really worried about getting close to people, hugging them, shaking hands, and what interaction is all about. So I thought it was an interesting conversation, and bottom line, it's wonderful that those gentlemen, those people in the Parts Manufacturing Association wanted to contribute, and all the rest of you that are contributing, thank you for what you're doing. Good night.